Everything you've been told about royal marriages is a lie. The fairy tales, the dignity, the romance of European monarchy, all carefully constructed myths designed to hide a grotesque truth that historians have buried for 2 centuries. Because on October 10, 1819, inside the Royal Palace of Madrid, a 16-year-old princess lost control of her bowels in sheer terror on her wedding night. And the man who caused that terror wasn't some barbaric warlord or drunken soldier. He was the King of Spain. Ferdinand VII didn't just rule a nation. He transformed the Spanish throne into a chamber of horrors so depraved that even the Pope had to intervene. This is the only documented case in European history where we have multiple eyewitness accounts from royal physicians, foreign diplomats, and the victims themselves, all describing the same horrifying anatomical reality that shaped a nation's destiny. What you're about to discover will completely shatter your understanding of royal power. Let me take you back to that infamous wedding night. October 1819. Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony sits trembling in her wedding chamber. Raised in a convent, innocent to the point of believing babies came from storks, she waits for her husband. Her German attendants, too embarrassed to explain what happens on a wedding night, simply dressed her in white and left her alone with a rosary. Then the door opens. What enters isn't a charming prince. It's a 35-year-old man, overweight, gouty, with thick protruding lips and the eyes of a predator. But that's not what makes her blood run cold. Ferdinand VII suffered from a condition so extreme that modern medical science still struggles to explain it. Macrogenitosomia. His genitals were monstrously oversized, but not in any normal way. French writer Prosper Mérimée, who interviewed courtiers present that night, described it in horrifying detail. Thin as sealing wax at the base, thick as a fist at the end, long as a billiard cue. Imagine being a sheltered 16-year-old girl raised by nuns, suddenly confronted with that. The young queen took one look and bolted from the bed, screaming in pure terror. Ferdinand, drunk on wine and lust, gave chase. Picture this: a morbidly obese king stumbling around the bedroom trying to catch his teenage bride, who's literally running for her life. The girl was fast. The king was not. Enraged by this insult, Ferdinand did what any reasonable monarch would do. He burst out of the bedroom completely naked, his deformity on full display, and began screaming at the queen's attendants. He called them incompetents and brutes, demanding they prepare the queen for him within 15 minutes. These poor ladies had to somehow explain to a terrified child what was about to happen to her. Whatever they said made things infinitely worse. When Ferdinand returned, ready to claim his rights as a husband, he was met with a smell that no amount of royal perfume could mask. The young queen, in her absolute terror, had lost complete control of her bowels. The King of Spain found his wedding bed soiled with human waste. He recoiled in disgust, declaring that queens do not possess such fragrances, and stormed out, refusing to touch his bride for over a week. But this was just the beginning of Maria Josepha's nightmare. To understand how a wedding night could go so catastrophically wrong, we need to talk about what Ferdinand was hiding under those royal robes. Multiple physicians who examined the king left detailed records. Dr. José María de la Fuente wrote that His Majesty possessed a member of such extraordinary dimensions that normal conjugal relations were rendered impossible without causing severe injury to his partner. But it wasn't just the size. The shape itself was an aberration of nature. This wasn't a blessing. This was a curse that had haunted Ferdinand since his first marriage at age 17. In 1802, young Prince Ferdinand married his cousin, Maria Antonia of Naples. On their wedding night, the prince merely gawked at his bride and awkwardly fondled her, repeatedly groping her bosom, unsure how to proceed. He literally didn't know how sex worked. For 11 months, this marriage went unconsummated. The prince would become aroused, attempt to mount his wife, then nothing. He physically couldn't figure out how to make it work. Maria Antonia's mother wrote increasingly frantic letters. "My daughter weeps nightly. The prince feels nothing. Attempts to induce him are useless." This situation is extraordinary and unfortunate for whoever is at his side. Eventually, the royal confessor had to intervene. A Catholic priest had to sit down with the future King of Spain and explain in explicit detail how to have sex with his wife. The humiliation spread through every European court. The Spanish heir was a sexual incompetent, a physical freak who couldn't perform the most basic marital duty. When he finally managed it after nearly a year of failures, the damage was catastrophic. Maria Antonia suffered 2 miscarriages, likely from internal injuries, and died at just 21. Her body broken by her husband's deformity. But here's the twisted part. Once Ferdinand finally figured out sex, he became obsessed with it. If this revelation is shocking you, smash that like button, because what comes next is even darker. When Ferdinand returned to power in 1814 after Napoleon's defeat, he was 30 years old, sexually frustrated, and drunk on absolute power. What followed was a decade of debauchery that would make ancient Rome blush. Every night, the king would slip out of the palace wearing a dark cloak. His destination? The seediest brothels in Madrid. His favorite was run by a madam nicknamed Pepa la Malaguine, an establishment so notorious that decent people crossed the street to avoid walking past it. But Ferdinand didn't go alone. He assembled a crew of young aristocrats, men as morally bankrupt as himself, and together they turned Madrid's red light district into their personal playground. Here's where it gets truly perverted. Ferdinand was so proud of his deformity, the very thing that had humiliated him in youth, that he turned it into a party trick. Multiple witnesses report the same stomach-turning scene. The King of Spain, drunk on cheap wine, would challenge his companions to measurement contests. Each man would expose himself, and they'd literally compare sizes. Ferdinand always won. His friends even gave him a nickname, El Bien Dotado, the well-endowed one. But the bragging was the least disturbing part. Ferdinand had developed a particular fetish, one that reveals the true depths of his depravity. In his own words, recorded by Count José María de Villalobos, the king boasted that they leave my bed certain that no other man can give them the pleasure I gave them. And do you know what I enjoy most after possessing them? Collecting the rags stained with the proof of their maidenhood. Let that sink in. The King of Spain collected blood-stained sheets from the virgins he deflowered. He kept them as trophies. This wasn't some medieval tradition. This was a personal fetish, a grotesque hobby that he pursued with the same enthusiasm other kings collected art. The prostitutes weren't his only victims. As he traveled around Spain, Ferdinand left a trail of ruined women. A widow in Aranjuez, a peasant girl in Seistan, servants in the palace who couldn't refuse their king. Each encounter added to his collection. Each bloody rag another trophy in his chamber of horrors. Meanwhile, Spain was falling apart. While Ferdinand spent his nights measuring genitals and collecting virgin blood, his country lost its entire American empire. Liberal reformers were executed by the thousands. The economy collapsed. But the king didn't care. He had brothels to visit, women to ruin, trophies to collect. In 1816, Ferdinand needed an heir. His solution? Marry his own niece. Maria Isabel of Braganza was 19, plain-looking, and Portuguese. Madrid's gossips greeted her with a cruel rhyme, ugly, poor, and Portuguese. But Maria Isabel had something her husband lacked, dignity. While Ferdinand continued his nightly brothel raids, she quietly founded the Prado Museum and opened the Royal Academy to women artists. Ferdinand barely noticed. To him, she was just a womb, a vessel for the heir he desperately needed. And in 1818, she finally became pregnant. This is where Ferdinand's story transforms from grotesque comedy to pure horror. When Maria Isabel went into labor, complications arose immediately. The baby was breech. The queen was fading. The royal physicians faced a choice: save the mother or save the child. Ferdinand made the decision without hesitation. Save the child, he commanded. Cut her if you must. What happened next was witnessed by 12 people, all of whom left matching accounts. The surgeons began performing an emergency cesarean. Remember, this is 1818. No anesthesia beyond alcohol and opium. They sliced open the queen's abdomen, believing her unconscious. She wasn't. Midway through the procedure, Maria Isabel's eyes shot open and she let out a scream that echoed through the palace. She was awake, fully conscious, as they cut through her womb. The surgeons, panicking, continued their butchery as the queen writhed in agony. The baby was already dead, had been for hours. Maria Isabel bled out on the operating table, her final moments spent in unimaginable pain, sacrificed for a child that was never going to live. She was 21 years old. What do you think about a king who would make such a choice? Let us know in the comments, because Ferdinand's story gets even more disturbing. Within a year, he was shopping for wife number 3. Remember Maria Josepha, the 16-year-old who sold herself on her wedding night? That was just the opening act of her marital horror show. After the wedding night disaster, Ferdinand refused to touch his teenage bride for a week. When he finally returned to her bed, she fought him off with surprising strength. She bit. She scratched. She kicked him in his monstrous genitals hard enough to send the king howling from the room. But the resistance couldn't last forever. Ferdinand was the king. Maria Josepha was his property. So he tried a different approach: patience. Every night, he would enter her chamber. Every night, she would pray the rosary while he attempted to seduce her. The queen had a powerful weapon: ignorance. She genuinely believed babies came from storks. When Ferdinand tried to explain the facts of life, she accused him of lying, of trying to trick her into committing a mortal sin. God would not create such a vile method of creating life, she declared. You are testing my virtue with these lies. Weeks passed. Months. Ferdinand, the man who bragged about his sexual conquests, couldn't bed his own wife. Finally, Ferdinand played his trump card. He wrote to the Pope. Pope Pius VII, an elderly Italian who had survived Napoleon and thought he'd seen everything, received a letter that must have made him question his faith. The King of Spain needed the Holy Father to convince his wife to have sex with him. The Pope's response survives in the Vatican archives. His Holiness delicately explained that marital relations were not only permitted but required by God. Producing an heir was Maria Josepha's sacred duty. But even the Pope's letter wasn't enough. Maria Josepha agreed to submit to God's will, but only under certain conditions. She would pray the entire rosary before each encounter. She would keep her eyes closed throughout, and she would think of the Virgin Mary to maintain her spiritual purity. Imagine being Ferdinand. You're the absolute monarch of Spain. You have the power of life and death over millions. And you're lying there while your teenage wife recites Hail Mary while you try to consummate your marriage. It was, by all accounts, the least erotic relationship in royal history. 10 years they spent in this matrimonial purgatory. 10 years of rosary-accompanied intimacy. 10 years without producing a single child. When Maria Josepha died in 1829 at age 25, officially of fever, the court breathed a collective sigh of relief. Ferdinand had failed again. 3 wives, 2 dead, 0 legitimate heirs. At 45, diseased from decades of debauchery, Ferdinand had one last chance. If you're still watching, hit that subscribe button, because you need to hear how this impossible situation finally got resolved. And trust me, the solution is as bizarre as everything else in this story. Maria Cristina of Bourbon II Sicilies knew exactly what she was getting into. Unlike Ferdinand's previous wives, she came prepared. At 23, she was beautiful, intelligent, and ruthlessly practical. She was also Ferdinand's niece, because apparently incest was the only Bourbon tradition he actually respected. But Maria Cristina had studied her predecessor's failures. She understood that producing an heir wasn't just about politics. It was about solving an engineering problem. The solution came from an unlikely source, the royal physician, Dr. Antonio Hernandez. After examining the king's anatomy and reviewing the medical records of his previous marriages, the good doctor reached a startling conclusion. The problem wasn't just Ferdinand's size. It was the physics of the situation. If you're trying to plant a seed, but your tool is too large for the garden, you need to modify either the tool or the garden. Since modifying Ferdinand was out of the question, they had to get creative. Dr. Hernandez commissioned the royal craftsman to create a special cushion made of the finest silk and stuffed with down feathers. But this wasn't just any cushion. Cut into its center was a precisely measured hole, exactly 4 centimeters deep. The physics were simple. Ferdinand would insert himself through the hole, which would act as a barrier, preventing him from causing the internal damage that had plagued his previous attempts at procreation. Only the tip, the functionally necessary part, would make contact. Maria Cristina presented this solution to her husband with the diplomatic skills of a seasoned negotiator. She framed it not as an acknowledgement of his deformity, but as a medical necessity for producing healthy heirs. Ferdinand's ego accepted this narrative, and it worked. Within 3 months, Maria Cristina was pregnant. October 10, 1830. The cannons of Madrid fired in celebration. Queen Maria Cristina had given birth to a healthy daughter, the future Isabella II. 2 years later, she produced a second daughter. Ferdinand finally had his heirs. It had only taken 4 wives, 2 deaths, 1 papal intervention, and a specially designed sex cushion. But the birth of Isabella created a new problem. Spanish law forbade female succession. Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, expected to inherit the throne. But Ferdinand, having literally engineered these heirs into existence, wasn't about to let technicality stop him. In a move that would plunge Spain into civil war, Ferdinand issued the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, overturning centuries of law to allow his daughter to inherit. When he died in 1833, his sexual dysfunction had one final consequence: the First Carlist War, a bloody conflict that would kill hundreds of thousands. All because a king with a monstrous deformity finally figured out how to use a cushion. But let's return to those trophies Ferdinand mentioned, his collection of bloodstained cloths. Because this is where Ferdinand's perversion reaches its darkest depths. After his death in 1833, Maria Cristina ordered a discreet inventory of the king's private chambers. What they found defied belief. Hidden in a cedar chest, wrapped in silk, dozens of cloth squares, each carefully labeled with a date and a name. Carmen, Pepa's house, March 1821. Isabella, palace servant, January 1823. Maria, widow of Aranjuez, September 1824. The king hadn't been exaggerating. He really had been collecting these grim mementos for nearly 2 decades. But the collection revealed something else, something palace observers had long suspected. The dates clustered around specific events. After every political setback, after every liberal uprising he crushed, after every execution he ordered, Ferdinand would add multiple trophies to his collection in quick succession. Violence in the throne room led to violence in the bedroom. One entry stood out to the investigators. Anna, 15 years, daughter of Colonel Bermudez, February 1823. Colonel Bermudez had been one of the liberal officers executed after the failed constitutional revolt. His daughter Anna had come to the palace to beg for her father's life. She left with her father dead and her innocence destroyed, memorialized in Ferdinand's sick collection. This wasn't just a king abusing his power for gratification. This was systematic predation, using intimacy as another tool of political terror. The full inventory was never made public. Maria Cristina ordered the entire collection burned, but not before several courtiers saw it and recorded what they witnessed. We know Ferdinand kept these trophies. We know he labeled them. We know he added to the collection after moments of political violence. What we don't know is how many women suffered to build this grotesque museum. When Ferdinand VII died on September 29, 1833, Spain barely mourned. His own brother immediately declared war. His daughter would face multiple civil wars defending the throne he'd engineered her onto. His widow quickly remarried a common guard, scandalizing the nation one final time. But Ferdinand's true legacy wasn't political. It was personal. He had transformed the Spanish monarchy from a sacred institution into a sordid joke. Every king after him would be tainted by association. His daughter Isabella II inherited more than just his throne. She inherited his appetites. Her own scandalous affairs led to her overthrow in 1868. The Bourbon dynasty that Ferdinand had literally forced into existence would be removed from power by his own bloodline's inherited depravity. Think about that cushion for a moment. A king so deformed that normal human reproduction required engineering intervention. A monarchy so desperate for heirs that it turned the royal bedroom into a medical procedure. That cushion represents everything wrong with Ferdinand's reign. Power corrupted to the point of physical manifestation. Legitimacy, so fragile it hung by a thread, or rather by a carefully measured hole in a silk pillow. Perhaps the cruelest irony is this. Ferdinand VII is remembered not for any great achievements, not for any noble deeds, but for his grotesque anatomy and the suffering it caused. He wanted to be el deseado, the desired one. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, a reminder that power without humanity creates monsters. Every historian who studies his reign reaches the same conclusion. Stanley Payne wrote, "Cowardly, selfish, grasping, suspicious, and vengeful." The Duke of Wellington observed, "The most contemptible of God's creatures." They're all correct. but they're also too kind. Because Ferdinand VII wasn't just a bad king. He was a predator with a crown, a man who turned his physical deformity into a weapon, a ruler who collected human suffering like others collected art. In the end, that's his true legacy, not the throne he passed to his daughter, not the civil wars he sparked, not even the grotesque cushion that finally gave him an heir. His legacy is in the unnamed women in that burned collection, the servants who couldn't refuse, the virgins who became trophies, the wives who died or lived in terror. Ferdinand VII proved that monsters don't need to hide under beds or in dark forests. Sometimes they wear crowns and rule nations. Sometimes they're celebrated as kings. And sometimes, just sometimes, history remembers them for exactly what they were. So here's my question for you. How many more stories like this are still buried in royal archives, waiting to be discovered? What other horrors did the so-called divine right of kings allow to happen behind palace walls? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want more shocking historical truths that they don't teach in schools, subscribe and join our community of history seekers who aren't afraid to confront the past as it really was. Because the horrors of the bedroom have shaped more history than any battlefield.